Hello, my name is Brandon Frame. Welcome to All Learning is Social and Emotional, leveraging SEL to design instructional practices. I'm excited to discuss social emotional learning and its central relationship to academics with you. I want to start off with a story. I had different English teachers, and I excelled in some classes more than others. Why was this? Because one teacher, Miss Reitman, ensured that every student participated, and she fostered our connection to the world around us and to each other. This enabled me to flourish. My other teachers were lecturers. There was little interaction with peers. Miss Reitman taught me that all learning takes place in a social and emotional context, and we learn through connection. I always wondered why I flourished in one class over the other, and here's the reason. People don't learn in disconnected pods or where information is disconnected. It's not how learning works. And today, we'll talk about why that is, how we leverage the interactive and emotional nature of learning and the social emotional dimensions of teaching and learning. The objective we will meet is to be able to identify how students' social emotional skills contribute to the effectiveness of instructional strategies used in education. And we'll be able to recognize how instructional strategies facilitate students' social, emotional, and academic development. So where do we start? I want to take us back. Take us to the early 1920s, when Vygotsky's zone of approximal development was developed by Lev Vygotsky. The zone of approximal development tells us that learning occurs at the edge of what students know and can do for themselves through the facilitation, guidance, and encouragement from a knowledgeable person. This also reminds us that learning is inherently a social, emotional process. But why? Because learning can be a frustrating process, since learning something new happens in this uncomfortable middle spot. Learning doesn't happen in pods, as I mentioned before. Vygotsky says, quote, the distance between the actional development level as determined by independent problem solving and the level of potential development as determined through problem solving under adult guidance or in collaboration with more capable peers. This quote highlights that we have to help children move through the zone of approximal development with the adult guidance or in collaboration with more capable peers. Which means, under this theory, to move a child through the zone of approximal development, it is vital that we focus on the following: the presence of someone with knowledge and skills beyond that of the learner, social interactions with a skillful tutor that allow the learner to observe and practice their skills, scaffolding and supportive activities provided by the educator or more competent peer to support the student as they are led through the zone of approximal development. You may be wondering, where does SEL play a role here? Well, I have alluded to it in the prior definition a bit, but the educator's role, mediating the child's learning activity as they share knowledge through social interaction. Mediating is facilitating the child's learning. Social interactions support us to understand things. This means that all learning occurs in a social context through social interactions, whether they are through a teacher, a counselor, a peer, or another resource. Also, all learning evokes an emotional reaction. Now, let's link Vygotsky's zone of approximal development to the Yerkes-Dodson law. In this law's central graph, the y-axis is performance, x-axis is stress. The highest levels of engagement occur in the sweet spot, in the middle, so we're not bored and learning nothing new, and we're not overloaded. Connecting this to the zone of approximal development is through the more knowledgeable and supportive other that we get the optimal performance. And as we move students through this, learners will build their own learning process in order to do this on their own. Which brings me to my final point. What does this mean for us as educators? Well, we must create tasks and scaffolds that allow students to navigate the zone of approximal development through optimal social interactions, peer-to-peer or peer-to-teacher. And we must teach students to navigate and manage their own emotions in order for them to facilitate their learning. This will enable them to do this all on their own one day without your presence. I'm sure as an educator, you know better than anyone that emotions and social interactions impact learning. It's time to move from knowing that social emotional dimensions play a role in learning to intentionally harnessing them in our classrooms. Firstly, what do I mean by social emotional learning? Social emotional learning is the process through which children and adults develop the skills, attitudes, and values necessary to understand and manage life tasks such as cognitive learning, forming relationships, and the flexibility to adapt to challenges and expectations of a complex society. Let's break that down further into competencies. Competencies like self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and social management. Each of these competencies can be broken down into skills, the very skills critical to guiding ourselves and others through the zone of proximal development. Let's just provide one example of a skill that fits under those competencies to even more deeply connect how learning links to social emotional skills. For instance, under social awareness is the skill students can read and respond to social cues. So let's just say the instructional strategy you're employing in your classroom is turn-in talks, which allows partners or a small group of students to discuss the answers to a question set forth by a teacher or another student. As the students begin to share their thoughts and views, each learns to see the different perspective of thinking among their peers. By doing so, the student's learning is enhanced by the formation and articulation of an idea. This enables the student to have clarity of thought and have the ability to communicate their thoughts and ideas to another student. So let's ask 3 questions about turn-in talks. First question, what social emotional skill needs to be activated for students to be successful within this instructional strategy? For instance, in order to be successful with a turn-in talk, students need to use positive communication and social skills to interact effectively with others. Question 2, where have students been pre-taught the skills identified above? For instance, students have been pre-taught the skills through Lesson 2.4, collaborating effectively with the curriculum where they learn how to actively listen and work in groups. Question 3, what prompts or scaffolds will you use to activate these skills during the lesson? For instance, the prompts I'll use for my students to activate these skills are, quote, remember the importance of active listening skills when you are doing your pair share? So think about your classroom in school. What instructional strategies are being employed? And ask yourself those 3 questions. Again, what SEL skill needs to be activated for students to be successful within this instructional strategy? Where have students been pre-taught the skills identified above? And what prompts or scaffolds will you use to activate these skills during the lesson? Academic instruction is social and emotional and therefore already related to social emotional learning. And social emotional learning is already embedded in instruction. Let's make it even more intentional and ensure that social emotional skills necessary to facilitate effective instruction are explicitly taught and connected. So going back to Vygotsky, he taught that social interactions are the lever for the learning process, and that the emotional components of learning are as important as the cognitive. Social emotional learning encompasses the related emotional and interactive skills. Remember, it's not should I teach social emotional learning or academics. It's how can I ensure that learning includes explicit connections and instruction around social emotional skills. Because the social emotional nature of learning is already a reality. So scan your classrooms and make the social emotional learning and academic connections even more intentional to ensure that social emotional undergirding of academics is explicitly developed. Thank you, and remember, all learning is social and emotional.